Thanks, Joel. I give a lot of talks at police organized crime conferences, so it's kind of nice walking into one without first having to supply a urine sample. I'd like to begin by congratulating the CPJ for just winning the Dodd Prize in International Human Rights. There's no organization I can think of that deserves it more than the CPJ. You guys treat every journalist murder as a case that must be solved, lest the killers feel free to murder again. And I've interviewed dozens of reporters around the world whose colleagues were murdered, and they were all deeply grateful to your work. And I embarked on my book hoping to add to that work. On the opening page, there's an epigraph from Václav Havel. It says, I am not interested in why man commits evil. I want to know why he does good. And after covering organized crime for 20 years, I had that interest too. I'd written about why people committed evil. Now I wanted to write about why they did good. And studying the lives of murdered journalists gave me that opportunity. I cannot have even begun that study without the foundations of the CPJ's research and advice. Until the CPJ began publishing its findings, the public believed that journalists who died for a story were Western war correspondents caught in the crossfire. In reality, the way most journalists get killed matches what happened to a Sri Lankan editor earlier this year. His name was Lasantha Wickramatunge, and the CPJ references his murder in its Press Freedom Award to one of his colleagues, who was just sentenced to 20 years in jail for criticizing the government. Wickramatunge was famous for exposing that government's press freedom abuses, massive corruption, and atrocities committed against minorities. In retaliation, he'd suffered 2 beatings and a machine gun attack on his home. By early January, a wave of journalist murders and death threats left on his phone let him know he'd be next if he kept at his work. And so he wrote an editorial. He called it, "And Then They Came for Me," and he asked his paper to publish it after his murder. No other profession, he wrote, calls on its practitioners to lay down their lives for their art, save the armed forces, and in Sri Lanka, journalism. Countless journalists have been harassed, threatened, and killed. It has been my honor to belong to all those categories, and now especially the last. When finally I am killed, it will be the government that kills me. A few days later, he was on his way to work when a hit squad caught up with his car and, as he predicted, shot him dead. This was no crossfire in a war zone. He was premeditatively assassinated, and he knew he would be killed beforehand. He also knew by whom. Thanks to the CPJ, we know that almost 3/4 of the 750 journalists who've died in the line of duty since 1992 were targeted and murdered. The vast majority of journalists killed on the job for all reasons, 85%, have been local journalists, not foreign correspondents. Almost all the masterminds of their murders, 95%, have escaped punishment. I first ran into these murders with impunity while I was researching a book in the Philippines between 2000 and 2003. I was following the trail of a triad boss who'd escaped a 20-year jail sentence in Canada by staging his death in the Philippines. He correctly believed that the corrupt Philippine government would allow him to carry on his career with impunity. During those years, 14 Philippine journalists were assassinated. I noticed a pattern in their killings. They exposed corrupt politicians and businessmen. They were publicly threatened by the people they'd exposed. Many had predicted they would be killed even as they continued their exposés, and not one of their killers was brought to justice. Local press freedom groups staged protests and predicted more murders if the masterminds weren't prosecuted. None were, And in 2004, another 8 journalists were murdered after being warned to stay silent. Around the world in those same years, about 100 journalists were murdered. In the spring of 2005, as Joel said, the CPJ issued a bulletin called Marked for Death, which listed the 5 most murderous countries for journalists. In order of most killed since 2000, they were the Philippines, Iraq, Colombia, Bangladesh, and Russia. Now, while these countries had problems specific to their regions and cultures, they were very similar to the Philippines in the way criminality was licensed and protected. Their political leaders acted like gang bosses. They appointed their supporters to bureaucracies with the understanding that while their salaries would be low, their incomes would be high. Corruption, which is an ad hoc arrangement in some nations, was a formal structure in these places. In return for support and the sharing of spoils, the leaders granted impunity to officials. Lawlessness occurred within the law, and a system identical to organized crime was locked into the business of the nations. The people were robbed, and the rulers got rich, and anyone who attempted to expose the rulers found out very quickly how organized crime could be. The journalists who exposed the rulers also had similarities. Most worked low-paying jobs in remote areas. Bribery of journalists was the norm in their towns, but a lot of those assassinated were famous for being clean. And while many had predicted they would be murdered if they kept at their reporting, they persisted until the bloody end. I thought about that a lot. They knew they would be killed. They kept at their work, and they were killed. Now, while the CPJ scrupulously reported the details of these murder cases, it was not in their mandate to offer portraits of the personal lives of the victims. There was almost nothing on the internet about who they were as individuals. I wondered who these amazing people were. What were their personal and psychological motivations, their inner lives, birth to death, that led them to their last decision. To me, the psychological source of their courage was one of the most important questions I could ever address as a writer, a journalist, and a person. And so I chose representative cases in the 5 most murderous countries and set out to visit their hometowns, interview their families, colleagues, and if possible, the people who had ordered their murders. I had one question uppermost in my mind. What makes a local reporter stay on a story after being threatened with certain death? I started in Colombia and I finished in Iraq. The research and writing took me about 4 years. Naturally, there were a lot of unexpected events in the countries I visited. And tragically, one of those events involved the murder of a journalist I was scheduled to interview about 2 of her murdered colleagues. Her name was Anna Politkovskaya, and she was shot dead while I was in the air on my way to meet her in Moscow. Journalists were being murdered all the time while I was researching their countries, and I added victims to my list. In the end, I chose 7 journalists for full biography. All lived in towns where 3 or 6 or 20 of their colleagues had been murdered with impunity in the years before they themselves were murdered. I'll give you cameo portraits of each, what they were up against, and then I'll get to their complex inner lives and personal motivations. I began with a 63-year-old economics reporter in Colombia. His name was Guillermo Bravo Vega, and he won the Colombian equivalent of the Pulitzer Prize. He lived in a town called Neiva, which the local press called Pablo Chico Inferno Grande. It means small town, big hell. He published a magazine about the corrupt state economy and produced a TV show on the same theme. His chief targets were Governor Jaime Lozada and his cronies. All were untouchable because they were members of a hereditary clan known locally as the Opitas Mafia.